So Elise, thank you very much for agreeing for this interview. That's a great pleasure.
Likewise.
I would maybe also introduce you to our viewers. Yeah. Elise is a docent and a senior research fellow at the Tampere Peace Research Institute in Finland, and she lectures for the master's program in peace, mediation and conflict research. Before moving to Finland, she held permanent positions at the University of Kent and at Sciences Po Lille in France. And her fields of expertise include conflict-generated diaspora politics, conflict prevention, gender and peace negotiations, masculinities and conflicts, sexual violence in conflict settings, as well as post-colonial interstate relations. And so in this interview, we are going to talk exactly about that, especially about feminist peace research, what it means, and what maybe policy implications it has, also for some particular conflicts that are happening today. Okay. And so my first question would be a bit personal. Since you're a peace researcher, what peace means for you? How do you define the work and the word for yourself?
Yeah, it's a complicated question because there's little agreement among peace researchers with regards to how to define peace. I mean, personally, to me, peace is a horizon. It's an ideal we try to reach, but it's always in the making. So it's a process. So you're never quite there. You always have to work for peace. So it means, in particular, fighting against any type of injustice. So it's not just about the absence of physical violence, for instance. It can also mean all types of symbolic violence, cultural violence, and other types of violence.
Can you maybe shortly elaborate on what peace researchers do and what specifically feminist peace researchers do?
Well, peace researchers generally study the conditions for peace, what would be necessary to establish peace. They also study the different types of violence, and they look at all sorts of different topics, like, for instance, peace movements. They look at transitional justice, peace building, and so on and so forth. Feminist peace research is a bit different, I would say, because feminist peace research has a specific interest in peace with justice. So it's not just about the silence of the weapons, it's also about trying to think about a society that is more just for everybody, and especially for the more vulnerable groups among us. So that can be gender and sexual minorities, but that can also be religious groups, that can be minority language groups, and so on and so forth. People with disabilities, and so on and so forth. So feminist peace research pays specific attention to those groups and how to bring justice and peace, or peace with justice, to those groups. I would say it's also different in the sense that it challenges many of the binaries upon which conventional peace research is built. One of them is the binary between theory and activism, making this completely, separate, or at least attempting to make this separate. Feminist peace research is very much normative, and it also includes activists, at the core. Another binary that feminist peace research contests is the male-female binary, and showing that, gender constructions are sometimes much more complex, and that we have to acknowledge that complexity and take it into account both in research and in policy. And also maybe the most important binary that feminist peace research contests is the binary between peace and conflict, or peace and violence, if you want, by showing that there is a continuum of violence between, first of all, times of peace and times of conflict. One good example of that is sexual violence during conflicts, which can also be explained by patriarchal structures that pre-existed before the conflict. And of course, those patterns of patriarchal relations and values and norms are present before the conflict, during the conflict, but also after the conflict. So the continuum of violence, if you want, in time, but also the continuum of violence in space, by showing how violence happening at the local level can only be understood in relation to what's happening at the global level and vice versa. So we have to make these connections. It's a complicated and kind of lengthy process, if you want, but it's a necessary process, or at least this is what peace researchers argue. And they also work on, feminist peace research also pays attention to topics which are usually maybe not necessarily sidelined, but not put at the center by conventional peace researchers, which tend to focus on peace building, conflict management, conflict containment, and so on and so forth. And feminist peace researchers will pay attention to different types of violence, like epistemic violence, for instance, violence through or against knowledge, for instance, it's a type of attitude, for instance, whereby we tend to silence or ignore knowledge produced by certain groups, for instance, indigenous groups. So feminist peace research really pays attention to those phenomena and those groups, like for instance LGBTQI plus people, who are not necessarily centered in conventional peace research.
So you already gave some specific example what feminist peace research deals with. Can you maybe also then bridge it to the policy level? What does it mean on the policy level? How can it be implemented?
Yeah, well, it's a difficult and a very slow process because for a very long time, feminist principles were equated in the minds of policymakers with including women. And for the past, I would say, decade or so, many feminist peace researchers have insisted on the fact that it's not just about including women, and most of all, it's not about including any women. And so and this is a message that is slow to be swallowed and integrated by the policy community. One of the fields where I can say that feminist peace research has had an impact is with regards of feminist peace security studies, if you want, peace and security studies, is the field of feminist foreign policy, which was, the concept was first introduced in 2014 by Sweden. And it has been adopted by a series of other countries since. It has become quite a popular concept, not just in Europe. I mean, we have countries like Mexico, Canada, for instance, that have officially adopted a feminist foreign policy. And it's basically the idea that foreign policy should be guided by at least two principles. Then you have, of course, nuances depending on the countries adopting it. The first is that feminist foreign policy should strive for women's rights. And the second is that feminist policy should strive for gender equality. And we already can see, the impact of these feminist principles for the countries implementing such feminist foreign policy. So, for instance, in 2015, Sweden cancelled a military cooperation contract with Saudi Arabia on the grounds that women's rights in Saudi Arabia were not respected, and so that led to cancelling the contract. Another very concrete impact is how gender equality as a principle is more and more included as a condition for development aid, for instance. So you can see like concrete, implications of adopting a feminist foreign policy. Although I would argue that for many countries, it's more buzzword. It's a pinkwashing, if you want. But some countries, especially in the Nordic countries, I'm thinking about Sweden, of course, but also Finland, in some respect, are taking these principles quite seriously. So it has an impact. Yeah.
let me ask you about another area of your research, and that is namely diaspora, your research in diaspora from a feminist peace research perspective.
Yep.
How does this type of approach differ from any other study of diaspora?
I'm not sure it differs from all the other areas, but one of the things that feminist peace approaches to diaspora studies has done is that it has really helped to challenge the essentialization of diaspora groups. So basically showing how diverse those groups are internally, but also how shifting, these groups are in terms of power relations, but also in cultural terms, how the, for instance, models of masculinities and feminities within diaspora groups evolve with time. Because very often there is this assumption or representation, rather, in policy-making fields and also in the broader public representations, that diaspora groups tend to be very traditional, very patriarchal. And what feminist peace research has shown is that it's true, but only up to a certain extent. That it's true that, for instance, diaspora leaders tend to try to enforce very traditional patriarchal role models for diaspora members, like whereby men and women are expected to stay within certain roles and behave in a certain way. But what the feminist approaches to diasporas have shown as well is that there are also ways in which those gender roles can be contested because of the diaspora setting. So, for instance, women finding better paid work, than their husbands, for instance, or even they find work, but their husbands cannot find work, and how that helps reconceptualizing, if you want, or shifting power relations within couples. And also, when you think about patriarchal relations within diaspora groups, for instance, diaspora groups residing in, for instance, Western Europe, and those diasporas originating from, let's say, global South countries, very often the types of masculinities or the way those masculinities are seen by the broader population is very negative. So there is a very negative perception of quote-unquote black masculinities, among the Western societies, for instance. And that can lead to, diasporic men being empowered within the domestic sphere, because they, perform this traditional culture, but being disempowered, in the wider public space because of these negative perceptions against the masculinity of men of color, for instance. And also what feminist peace research has shown is that gender and sexual minorities in diaspora groups, of course, they tend to face a lot of opposition from diaspora leaders, because diaspora leaders are very keen on promoting a very clean view of diaspora groups, respecting norms and very heteronormative and so on and so forth. And gender and sexual minorities have been at the forefront, of this struggle, activism in countries like the US, for instance, for claiming more rights for gender and sexual minorities, for instance. So it's not, if you want, in a nutshell, feminist peace research, when applied to diaspora studies, has really shed light of the complexity of those relations, which tend to be really simplified in media and policy representations.
Probably the very topical issue with regards to diaspora today, of course, concerns the war in Ukraine and the large numbers of refugees from Ukraine, who are mostly women, children and elderly, who came to Europe. So it's of course hard or impossible to predict the implications of that, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit on what this means for the already existing diasporas in these European countries where the refugees came to, and what it means for the governments in these countries. How can they, what basically they can and should do with regards to this new reality?
Yeah, it's an extremely complex question, and it's difficult to answer in any definite way on these questions. First of all, because the situation is evolving, and when you look at how diasporas and refugees react with regards to conflicts happening in their countries of origin, usually this attitude shifts with time. So when the conflict is at its peak, usually peace movements, for instance, peace activism, takes a very low profile position. And then when the conflict de-escalates, then usually you have that peace activism that takes center stage, and that, you know, they try to do peace advocacy, to help with negotiation, to help with reconstruction, and so on and so forth. Right now we are still in the peak phase, and so what we can see is that is both from the older diaspora groups, which you mentioned, those that were already settled before the war, and also among the new refugees, you see a lot of support for Ukraine. So a lot of crowdfunding, for instance, for providing support for the Ukrainian population, like humanitarian aid in Ukraine, but also support for the military in Ukraine. So that is something that is not really contested, I would say. You see also a lot of advocacy of these groups in order to push for the governments in the countries where they reside to act vis-à-vis Ukraine. So sending more weapons, sending more funding, and so on and so forth. But it's very difficult to predict how it will evolve in time. And one of the reasons why it's even more complicated than usual to predict anything is that, as you were saying, these new arrivals are really not usual. Because when you think about, diasporas and migration, usually you have groups, especially from conflict areas or so-called conflict areas. It's either families arriving or men arriving. And in the case of the Ukrainian diaspora, it's completely different. You have women, children, and elderly people. And so that completely changes not just the dynamics of welcoming those refugees, because as I'm sure you know, there is always this knee-jerk reaction against migrants because they are young men, with all the stigma associated to, their potential for violence and things like this. So now in that case, you don't have that many young men arriving. So that changes that perception, but that also changes the relation within, the diaspora group itself. So how that is going to evolve, it's anybody's guess, because we don't really have that many precedents, to rely upon and try to understand how it can evolve.
And if you think of governments of the European Union states, member states, what would you say they should be maybe mindful of if they're designing new policies or trying to help those people who arrive?
Yeah, well, it depends what they want to achieve. But I think that it's clear that they have to be mindful of the specific composition of those groups. I mean, as far as I know, the immense majority, like 97–98% of those people still today, I think I was reading those figures a few days ago, wish to go back to Ukraine as soon as possible. So that they are not looking for permanent positions, permanent jobs in the countries of settlement. They are more like, planning, surviving and then planning to go back. So that's, I think, something that perhaps make it a bit different, but again, maybe the situation will change. Maybe the attitudes will change, if the war in Ukraine lasts for much longer, or if reconstruction is particularly complicated in Ukraine. But also, I think that what makes it specific is this composition of the diaspora groups. And I think that if there is something that I've learned with my research is that governments tend to have this blanket policy with regards to diaspora groups. They don't really care about the specificities of those groups. They think it's too complicated, and so they think very much in terms of integration, or you have to learn the language and you have to find a job and an accommodation, things like this, but they don't really think in terms of specificities. And I think that this is really something that should be thought through, and governments definitely should pay more attention to the specific positionalities, but also power relations within those groups. I mean, this is also something that feminist peace research has well shown, and diaspora studies in general have well shown, that all diaspora groups are extremely diverse. You have a lot of cleavages, you have a lot of different positionalities within each diaspora groups. But in the case of the Ukrainian diaspora, it's, I think, a really important factor.
Thank you very much for your time and insights.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.